Okay, tonight, we're stepping into the shadows of Newport, Oregon, a town that seemed quiet on the surface, yet harbored a secret that would remain hidden for more than 3 decades. Imagine a teacher disappearing, a car abandoned at a cliff's edge, and whispers of suicide masking something far darker. The evidence left behind was subtle, easily overlooked, yet pregnant with silent screams. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Here we explore the spaces between words, the cracks in human behavior, and the chilling calm of crimes long forgotten. Tonight we revisit the 1991 cold case of Millie Pinkman, a dedicated teacher whose disappearance exposed hidden tensions within her town. Decades later, an arrest shattered long-held assumptions, forcing the community to confront betrayal, authority, and the quiet darkness that had lingered beneath the surface, long obscured by time and trust. Millie Pinkman was the type of teacher who carried the weight of her students' struggles as if they were her own. Her dedication in the classroom was unmatched. She arrived early, left late, and nurtured every mind entrusted to her care. Yet, beyond her professional world, Millie's life was layered with tension, shadows of family discord, and the subtle anxiety that often accompanies those who bear responsibility quietly. Her marriage to Tom Pinkman was strained. Their communication was sparse, replaced by polite routines and unspoken resentments. Millie's anxiety had become more pronounced in the months leading up to her disappearance. Friends noted fleeting moments of distraction, distant gazes, and a hesitancy to share even the mundane. These are not obvious signs to outsiders, yet they often signal a mind carrying burdens invisible to the world. Gerald Ashford, the high school principal, presented a stark contrast. Respected, commanding, and meticulous, he was a figure whose authority few dared question. On the surface, he was charming, socially adept, and deeply involved in the community. But his psychological profile hinted at a pervasive need for control, a subtle coercion masked by civility. Those who crossed him or even disagreed subtly often felt his quiet pressure, a manipulation cloaked in courtesy. Newport itself was a town that appeared serene, its coastline and small streets evoking simplicity. Yet, like many small towns, secrets simmered beneath the surface. Families carried histories they preferred untouched, gossip circulated with precision, and reputation held weight above transparency. Millie's family, in particular, had its own hidden fractures, pressures that contributed to her mental load and heightened vulnerability. Signs of Millie's inner tension were subtle yet persistent, almost imperceptible to those around her. She spoke sparingly, her smiles fleeting, and she often avoided confronting conflicts even when circumstances demanded it. Friends and colleagues might have overlooked these behaviors as mere introversion or stress, but a closer examination reveals deeper unease. Her meticulous planning for daily tasks, her habit of leaving detailed work notes, and her careful organization were not mere efficiency. They were attempts to assert control over aspects of life where she felt powerless. Each small action hinted at an internal struggle quietly intensifying over time. Gerald Ashford's world intersected with hers under the guise of professional interaction. Meetings in his office, brief consultations about school events, and minor disagreements slowly constructed a power dynamic that would later prove pivotal. Ashford's psychological landscape suggested an individual who conflated rejection with personal threat, whose fragile ego demanded submission, and whose desire to control was both a professional necessity and a personal obsession. In the context of this environment, the stage for tragedy was quietly set. Millie, cautious yet unassuming, navigated the small town's expectations while carrying her own burdens. Ashford, authoritative yet internally volatile, moved through his own carefully constructed world. The collision of these lives, seemingly ordinary, would give rise to extraordinary consequences. The tension between Millie's anxiety and Ashford's control reflected broader philosophical questions. The Stoics might observe her quiet endurance as resilience constrained by circumstance. Christian teachings would frame the moral responsibilities and sins hidden behind polite facades. Buddhist thought might reflect on the impermanence of safety and the subtle suffering in everyday life. These layers deepen our understanding of not only the individuals, but the moral and psychological landscape they inhabited. Millie's final days were marked by small, almost imperceptible shifts. She maintained her routines, yet subtle signs suggested an unease that cannot be measured in words. The careful observer would note the change in her handwriting, a hesitancy in speech, or the fleeting expressions of dread before school meetings. These traces, like faint fingerprints, were invisible to those who considered her life normal, but to a trained eye they revealed the tension simmering below the surface. Ashford, by contrast, exhibited the opposite signs: precise schedules, calculated interactions, and a controlled demeanor. Yet within this control was a latent volatility. Minor frustrations could trigger disproportionate responses, while perceived slights became deeply internalized. In retrospect, these traits map directly onto behaviors observed in future investigations. Patterns that law enforcement initially missed due to the community's trust in his status. Small-town dynamics amplified these psychological contrasts. Newport was a microcosm where reputation shaped perception. Families protected their own, authorities deferred to local leaders, and the silence surrounding difficult truths created fertile ground for unobserved manipulation. Millie's disappearance, therefore, was not simply a personal tragedy, but a reflection of systemic vulnerabilities that allowed control, obsession, and secrecy to flourish undetected. By the time she vanished, Millie's subtle signals had gone unnoticed. Her family sensed tension but not danger. Colleagues recognized absence but not malevolence. The town assumed routine explanations: a spontaneous departure, a personal crisis, or, as initial evidence would suggest, an accident. This collective misperception highlights the importance of context in psychological profiling. The intersection of personality, environment, and community behavior can mask intention and obscure truth. The dynamics between Millie and Ashford were emblematic of deeper psychological themes: the intersection of authority and vulnerability, the latent threat in socially respected positions, and the quiet spiral that occurs when anxiety meets obsessive control. Philosophically, one might reflect on this as a meditation on the fragility of trust and the subtle ways power manifests in human relationships. The psychological foreshadowing is clear in retrospect. Millie's patterns, Ashford's behaviors, and the town's complicity in overlooking tension coalesced into a scenario where tragedy was not just possible, it became probable. The human mind, capable of both empathy and cruelty, is especially potent when contextualized within structures of power, social expectation, and unspoken obligation. By analyzing these intersecting lives, we gain insight not merely into a crime, but into the anatomy of latent threats, the psychology of control, and the quiet signals of imminent danger. Millie and Ashford's story is a study in contrasts: vulnerability against dominance, anxiety against obsession, silence against projection. The town of Newport, unwittingly, became a laboratory for the complexities of human behavior, secrecy, and moral compromise. The morning of Millie's disappearance began like any other, with familiar routines that offered a semblance of stability. She arrived at the high school, exchanged polite greetings with students and colleagues, and moved through her day with practiced composure. Yet, hidden beneath this ordinary facade was a small, unsettling signal, a message she had received hours earlier, consisting of nothing more than the single letter G. Innocuous to the untrained eye, the letter carried an unspoken weight, a subtle psychological charge that reflected authority, looming expectation, and an implicit threat. It foreshadowed an encounter that would shatter normalcy and foreshadow the extraordinary danger waiting within the walls of Ashford's office. Millie's last known meeting was in Ashford's office, officially to discuss school logistics. Witnesses later described her entering confidently, yet with a subtle tension. Ashford's demeanor was controlled, polite, almost cordial, but those who observed them noted micro-expressions of frustration and insistence, subtle assertions of dominance. Their interaction, brief and outwardly professional, belied the undercurrents that would later surface in investigation. The timeline that followed is reconstructed from interviews, statements, and forensic evidence. Gerald's statements conflicted with those of the security guard, particularly regarding the time he left the building. Discrepancies were small, but crucial. Each delay, each shift in recollection added a layer of ambiguity, a fog that initially obscured the events of the day. The small town, predisposed to trust its high-ranking figures, accepted the narrative without deep scrutiny. Later that afternoon, Millie's car was discovered abandoned at a cliffside overlook. The positioning of the vehicle suggested a potential accident or suicide. However, investigators noted anomalies. A single glove left inside the car, footprints incongruent with the driver's profile, and the absence of personal items that Millie would never leave behind. These details, subtle yet significant, pointed to staging rather than spontaneity. The psychological implications of the staged scene run far deeper than they appear. The presence of a single glove, whether placed intentionally or left by accident, carries layered meaning. It asserts control while simultaneously hinting at a concealed narrative that only careful analysis can uncover. This small object functions as a trace of action, a cryptic message and, in a sense, a silent confession, speaking volumes without words. The human mind, under extreme stress, or when executing a deliberate act, often leaves behind fragments that betray unconscious patterns of thought and intention. In this case, such fragments, the glove, the car's placement, and subtle inconsistencies, later became pivotal in decoding the perpetrator's mindset, revealing how hidden psychological forces shape behavior and leave indelible, though understated, evidence. Weeks turned into months with no new leads. Initial investigations, constrained by assumptions and community trust, failed to connect the inconsistencies. Millie's absence became a point of quiet speculation, with the media covering the story briefly before shifting focus. Friends and family, particularly her husband Tom, were left navigating a landscape of suspicion, grief, and unspoken accusation. It wasn't until decades later that further scrutiny revealed more disturbing evidence. The discovery of skeletal remains in a remote area confirmed the worst. Millie had been murdered. Accompanying the remains was a wedding ring engraved with initials matching Gerald Ashford, a tangible link between perpetrator and victim. Forensic technology, unavailable in 1991, finally provided clarity, demonstrating the slow but inevitable uncovering of truth. The timeline reveals both the meticulous planning and the impulsive errors characteristic of the crime. Ashford's controlled exterior masked internal volatility, while Millie's cautiousness and attempts to maintain normalcy were tragically insufficient against a manipulative aggressor. Each detail, from the timing of meetings to the placement of objects, reflects the interplay of human psychology, power dynamics, and the subtle art of deception. Consider the ethical dimension embedded in these actions. The act of leaving the car staged as an accident is both literal and symbolic, a representation of the attempt to rewrite reality, to obscure moral accountability. Philosophically, it raises questions about perception, truth, and the ways humans manipulate evidence of their own consciousness. The crime was not only against Millie's life, but against collective trust and societal understanding. Evidence of cognitive dissonance appears in Gerald's post-crime behavior. Outwardly compliant and socially present, he maintained normal routines, yet microscopic deviations betrayed the inner disturbance. Security footage, witness recollection, and forensic traces, once reanalyzed decades later, revealed patterns consistent with someone habituated to control, accustomed to masking impulses beneath a veneer of civility. The crime timeline also exposes the psychology of oversight. Small towns bound by social hierarchies and assumptions of decency can inadvertently shield perpetrators. The community's trust in Ashford, combined with systemic investigative shortcomings, illustrates how societal perception can inadvertently prolong injustice. Millie's last hours exemplify the fragility of ordinary life against extraordinary malice. From receiving the cryptic message to entering the office and ultimately being removed from the scene, her trajectory highlights the interplay between free will, vulnerability, and predation. Each moment, seemingly mundane, becomes loaded with existential weight, when viewed through the lens of what was to come. The cliffside staging is particularly notable in psychological terms. It reflects a mixture of guilt, risk calculation, and an unconscious desire to communicate. Such behaviors, when studied across similar cases, demonstrate a recurring pattern. Perpetrators often leave symbolic traces even while attempting concealment. In Ashford's case, the glove, the car, and later the wedding ring function as silent markers of identity, ownership, and narrative control. By closely examining the timeline and the intricate details of Millie's disappearance, the true architecture of the crime begins to emerge. What appeared casual on the surface, missed appointments, minor inconsistencies, abandoned objects, was carefully orchestrated, a precise manipulation hidden beneath normalcy. Spontaneous actions and deliberate planning intertwined, creating a deceptive rhythm that obscured intent. Each element reflects a subtle interplay between fear, control, and authority, revealing how vulnerability and power collide in human behavior. Millie's story is therefore more than a sequence of events. It is a window into cognition under duress, moral conflict, and the fragile boundary separating everyday life from calculated atrocity, where silence often conceals the darkest truths. The initial investigation into Millie Pinkman's disappearance in 1991 was shaped as much by human perception as by facts. Gerald Ashford, the principal of the high school and a long-standing pillar of the Newport community, was largely beyond suspicion. His reputation afforded him a kind of psychological immunity. Investigators, constrained by assumptions and the social hierarchy, focused almost exclusively on the surface narrative. Millie's car, abandoned precariously near a cliff, appeared to signal either an accident or suicide. Small anomalies were noted: the single glove left inside the vehicle, subtle inconsistencies in witness accounts, but these were dismissed as inconsequential. Such dismissal exemplifies a recurring error in criminal psychology. When a figure of authority is widely trusted, evidence that contradicts collective expectation is often overlooked, no matter how telling. Witness accounts introduced minor discrepancies that, under a different lens, might have seemed significant. The school's security guard recalled inconsistencies in Ashford's timeline, particularly regarding his departure from the building, which conflicted with other observations. Yet investigators leaned toward Ashford's version, influenced by social perception, authority bias, and the psychological inertia of a town that revered its leaders. Subtle cues of stress, hesitation, or guilt, behaviors that modern profiling would readily detect, passed unnoticed in 1991. The collective deference to authority created a blind spot, allowing an appearance of normalcy to mask underlying threat. The role of the media in shaping public perception was equally influential. Initial coverage fueled speculation and brief fascination, a temporary frenzy that soon gave way to silence. Local newspapers published sympathetic accounts of Millie's mysterious disappearance, emphasizing tragedy but lacking compelling sensational elements to maintain prolonged public attention. The community's response followed predictable social patterns. Friends quietly questioned motives, neighbors speculated, and family members like Tom Pinkman faced both subtle suspicion and social isolation. Grief, already profound, was compounded by scrutiny, adding layers of psychological burden that often go unrecognized in discussions of unresolved cases. The town's collective perception of Ashford functioned as a protective shield, effectively insulating him from suspicion. Psychologically, this is a textbook demonstration of social proof. When a figure is widely trusted, their actions and statements are unconsciously validated by collective consensus. Investigators failed to recognize the dissonance between Ashford's public persona and his private behavior. This oversight, combining elements of social psychology and investigative limitation, prolonged the mystery and deepened the trauma experienced by Millie's family. Authority, in this case, became both a tool for manipulation and a barrier to justice. Decades passed. The case grew cold, leaving Millie's loved ones in a state of unresolved grief and lingering doubt. Yet advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, offered a chance for clarity that was unavailable in 1991. In 2024, investigators reopened the case, re-examining skeletal remains and the few objects left behind. The wedding ring engraved with Gerald Ashford's initials, long overlooked, now provided a tangible connection that could not be ignored. Modern forensics allowed extraction of biological material, conclusively linking Ashford to the crime. The tools of science, combined with persistent analytical scrutiny, finally pierced the veil of decades-long uncertainty. The revelation was shocking. A man once considered incorruptible, a figure of moral authority and community respect, was revealed to be a murderer who had successfully evaded justice for over 30 years. Public reaction was intense, ranging from disbelief to outrage. But beneath these emotions lay a subtler psychological phenomenon: cognitive dissonance. The community struggled to reconcile the image of Ashford, the trusted principal, with the reality of his actions. This tension reflects the complexity of moral perception. Humans resist integrating information that threatens deeply held social beliefs, and the longer those beliefs are maintained, the harder the reconciliation becomes. For Millie's family, the reopening of the case was both vindication and renewed trauma. Tom Pinkman, who had endured years of suspicion, isolation, and unanswered questions, confronted a complicated psychological landscape. The confirmation of Ashford's guilt provided relief, but also reopened the wounds of grief and mistrust. Studies in delayed justice show that closure, achieved decades later, does not erase suffering. It reshapes it, creating a complex mixture of relief, lingering anger, and reflective sorrow. The psychological impact of unresolved trauma, prolonged by the inertia of flawed social assumptions, is often more enduring than trauma immediately acknowledged and addressed. Analysis of Ashford's behavior revealed a consistent pattern: a controlled narcissistic personality, outwardly composed, meticulous, and careful to avoid direct confrontation. Yet, unconscious behaviors, small errors, symbolic traces, and overlooked inconsistencies betrayed his internal volatility. In criminal psychology, this reflects a recurring principle. The more a perpetrator seeks to assert control, the more likely they are to leave inadvertent evidence. The mind under pressure externalizes internal tension, leaving fragments that eventually unravel deception. The interplay between conscious manipulation and unconscious expression becomes critical for investigators attempting to reconstruct truth from partial evidence. The case also revealed broader systemic vulnerabilities. Trust, social hierarchy, and implicit bias distorted investigative processes. Authority figures in insular communities often benefit from unexamined reverence, creating blind spots exploitable by those seeking to avoid scrutiny. Ashford's actions exemplify how calculated individuals manipulate social structures to prolong impunity. For the Newport community, the eventual revelation forced a reckoning. Appearances deceive, and social trust, while necessary for cohesion, is fragile in the face of concealed malice. Media representation evolved alongside the investigation. Initial reporting framed Millie's disappearance as mysterious, emphasizing tragedy without lingering analysis. After DNA evidence confirmed Ashford's involvement, coverage shifted toward shock, betrayal, and moral outrage. This evolution reflects societal tendencies. Uncertainty initially fascinates, yet revelation provokes deep reflection on ethics, trust, and human fallibility. Journalism, public perception, and forensic rigor together illustrate how societies interpret crime, suspense, and eventual resolution, highlighting the psychological mechanisms that shape collective understanding. Ashford's arrest marked the end of decades of forensic, psychological, and social scrutiny. Newport faced a collective reckoning, confronting long-held assumptions. Silence revealed uncomfortable truths. Appearances deceive, authority can mask malice, and morality, trust, and perception remain fragile, easily distorted by manipulation and cognitive bias. Understanding Gerald Ashford's behavior demands an integrated view of psychology, philosophy, and context. Psychologically, he exhibited hallmarks of narcissistic personality disorder: grandiosity, craving for admiration, and absence of empathy. His polished facade of control concealed deep insecurity and fear of rejection. Even minor acts of independence from Millie destabilized his fragile ego, transforming anxiety into hostility. Beneath his composed exterior, entitlement battled vulnerability, creating a volatile tension between dominance and fear. His calm demeanor was a deliberate mask, crafted to protect a fractured identity and sustain the illusion of superiority that, once threatened, exposed the chaotic and unstable core beneath his controlled surface. From a philosophical perspective, Ashford's actions expose deep moral and cognitive distortions. Stoicism advocates acceptance of what cannot be controlled, yet his fragile ego resisted this truth. His identity depended on domination rather than balance, leading him to deny reality and justify his impulses. Small frustrations became battlegrounds where insecurity bred aggression. Through a Buddhist lens, his attachment to image, status, and authority enslaved him to suffering. Clinging to illusion, he magnified pain for himself and others. Unable to align his inner world with external reality, he turned vulnerability into manipulation, control into self-defense. In the end, his cruelty reflected not only corruption of empathy, but the moral collapse born from unrestrained desire. During the trial, Ashford's psychological and moral fractures became unmistakable. Observers saw a man of measured calm, whose precise speech masked volatility beneath restraint. His testimony and demeanor revealed how reason and pathology can coexist, allowing violence to hide within normalcy. Both defense and prosecution dissected his past, his relationships, ambitions, and insecurities, exposing a fragile narcissism shaped by validation and stress. The proceedings transformed from legal process to moral reckoning. His sentence, life imprisonment without parole, stood as society's acknowledgement of how unchecked control and ego can corrupt humanity's boundaries between order, deceit, and destruction. For Millie Pinkman's family, however, justice did not erase the psychological devastation. Trauma research emphasizes that unresolved crimes perpetuate secondary trauma, compounding grief through uncertainty and public scrutiny. For decades, Tom Pinkman and his family endured an existence suspended between hope and despair, marked by unspoken fear and community whispers. When Ashford's guilt was finally confirmed, the truth brought clarity but not comfort. Closure, they learned, is not the end of suffering, but a reconfiguration of it, a way to contain pain within narrative form. Their outrage became a means of reclaiming agency, transforming years of ambiguity into moral purpose. Yet the case also underscores a deeper truth about the human mind. Trauma persists in layers, resurfacing through memory and silence. Even definitive justice cannot fully restore what violence has undone. At the center of this tragedy lies the haunting question of motive. Why did Ashford target Millie specifically? Psychologists suggest a confluence of factors: proximity, perceived threats to ego, and the desire for absolute control. Victim selection often mirrors unconscious dynamics of power and resentment. To Ashford, Millie's independence represented both a challenge and a provocation, an affront to his constructed identity. Her assertiveness activated the very insecurities he sought to suppress, transforming admiration into hostility. Philosophically, the case raises darker questions. Is evil merely the ultimate expression of unrestrained desire? Are such acts embedded in the social and psychological architecture of human behavior, awaiting only the right convergence of vulnerability and opportunity? These questions emphasize the murky territory of motivation, where conscious justification and unconscious drive intertwine, producing moral catastrophe. The broader context of Newport itself contributed to Ashford's prolonged impunity. In small-town ecosystems, reputation and hierarchy often override skepticism. Ashford's position within the educational structure insulated him from scrutiny, while community deference to authority created cognitive blind spots. Early investigators, influenced by confirmation and authority bias, interpreted evidence through pre-existing expectations. Deviations from normal behavior were rationalized rather than questioned. This collective oversight illustrates how social trust, when unexamined, can inadvertently shield malice. It also exposes a universal vulnerability: human cognition's tendency to prefer coherence over truth. As technology advanced, modern forensics eventually dismantled the myths that had protected him. Retrospective analysis, unburdened by local bias, integrated scientific rigor with psychological profiling. DNA evidence provided not just physical confirmation, but insight into behavioral patterns, bridging intuition and empirical proof. The truth that emerged was both revelatory and sobering, that decades of assumption and politeness had obscured the presence of a predator hiding in plain sight. In the aftermath of his arrest, Newport entered a period of uneasy reflection. Conversations turned inward, to trust, to moral blindness, to the limits of perception. Residents grappled with the disturbing revelation that normality itself can be a disguise. Relief at resolution mingled with collective unease as the town confronted its complicity in overlooking subtle signs of danger. Silence became its own kind of reckoning, an acknowledgement that evil often thrives not in chaos, but in the quiet comfort of social order. Within that silence lay the community's shared contemplation of vulnerability and ethical failure, a recognition that perception, like morality, is fragile and fallible. Even with exhaustive investigation and psychological profiling, some aspects of Ashford's mind remain inaccessible. Motive, in its purest form, resists translation. It exists in fragments, between impulse and intention, between fear and desire. The case reminds us that human behavior cannot be reduced to a single theory. It is shaped by experience, culture, cognition, and circumstance, forming a mosaic that defies linear explanation. In Ashford's life and actions, each decision reflected a collision between inner chaos and social conformity. His crimes reveal the perilous tension between the desire for control and the inevitability of human limitation. Ultimately, the story of Gerald Ashford exposes the perilous fragility of moral order, the thin, shifting line that separates normalcy from atrocity. It is a lesson in the complexity of evil, reminding us that understanding requires both scientific precision and moral introspection. Beneath every facade of reason, the potential for destruction waits in silence, asking only for the right moment to surface. The resolution of the Millie Pinkman case reminds us that justice can be delayed but not denied. 33 years of silence, fear, and uncertainty were finally pierced by science, persistence, and analytical rigor. Yet the human psyche retains the memory of unanswered questions, and the community endures the psychological echoes of betrayal and loss. Reflection on this case invites contemplation of trust, authority, and the fragility of moral perception. If fear mirrors our own nature, what does it reveal about humanity's capacity for both harm and resilience? How can communities balance reverence with accountability and silence with truth? These questions persist, echoing long after verdicts are rendered, evidence is examined, or confessions are made, haunting the space between justice and understanding. Remember to like, share the video, and subscribe to Criminal Mindcast for more explorations of human darkness and moral complexity. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.